As Bessel van der Kolk so famously put it, the body keeps the score, the title of his seminal work. A great book, recommended. Indeed, the reservoir, the repository of your trauma, your abuse, your pain, your hurt, the uncertainty, the intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictability, the terror, the shocks, all these don't go away. They reside within your body, and they transform your body in ways which are sometimes counterintuitive. They render your body an enemy. They estrange you from your body. You feel alienated, as if this body that you have inhabited, sometimes for decades, is no longer familiar to you. And this is the topic of today's video. The video is divided in three parts. These are actually three different videos. The first video, the first part, is a general introduction to somatization. The second part is how narcissistic abuse specifically impacts your body. And the third part is a summary with some additional insights. It's much shorter. So visit any part of the video that fits you and get to know your body under the duress and the distress of narcissistic abuse, the most egregious and extreme form of maltreatment known to humanity. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, the first book ever on narcissistic abuse. I'm also a professor of psychology. Before we proceed, to remind you, I'm giving a seminar for 3 days about scientific, evidence-based ways to heal and recover from narcissistic abuse. All kinds of techniques and practices. 3 whole days, free of charge. All you have to do is be there physically. Now, there's a link in the description of the video. Click on the link and you will have all the details. Where, when, how, etc., etc. If you have any queries or any questions, the link also leads to my email addresses, and feel free to write to me. I promise to respond for a change. Okay, Shoshanim, Shoshanot, kiddos and kidettes, let's delve right into your bodies. As I said, the first part of the video is a general introduction to what is known as somatic symptoms or somatization. The second part deals with narcissistic abuse specifically and describes all the impacts and effects that narcissistic abuse has on your body. Generally speaking, we can divide the impacts of trauma and abuse in its various forms, and definitely the impacts of narcissistic abuse, in 2 parts: sleep disorders and somatic symptoms. Sleep disorders, as the name implies, is when you're having difficulties with sleep. You may oversleep, actually. You may be ravaged by insomnia. Whichever the case may be, sleep, in sleep or in the absence of sleep, your trauma and abuse try to manifest somehow, to express themselves. But this is not the topic of today's video. The topic of today's video is the rest of your body, apart from the sleep system. Somatization. According to the American Psychological Association dictionary, somatization is the expression of psychological disturbance in physical bodily symptoms. The first use of the word has controversially been attributed to Viennese psychoanalyst Wilhelm Stekel to describe what is now called conversion. I'll discuss conversion disorder or conversion symptoms in a minute. Some investigators, continues the dictionary, use the word in reference not only to the physical symptoms that occur in almost every type of anxiety disorder, but also to the expression of symptoms in such psychosomatic disorders as psychogenic asthma and peptic ulcers. Now, I'm not going to discuss psychosomatic disorders in this video because they are not reactive. They are not the outcomes of abuse. They have a different etiology. Somatization disorder, however, is often the result or the consequence of extreme anxiety, extreme tension, stress, duress, distress, and therefore has a place in this video. Again, we revert to the dictionary of the American Psychological Association, which defines somatization disorder this way. In the text revision of the 4th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, a somatoform disorder involving a history of multiple physical symptoms, at least 8, one of which must be a pseudoneurological symptom, of several years' duration, for which medical attention has been sought, but which are apparently not due to any physical disorder or to the effects of a substance, such as a medication. The complaints are often described in vague, yet colorful or exaggerated terms by the patient, who often appears anxious or depressed. Among the common complaints are feelings of sickliness, difficulty in swallowing or walking, malaise, blurred vision, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea, painful or irregular menstruation, sexual indifference, painful intercourse, pain in the back or joints, shortness of breath, palpitations, heart palpitations, and chest pain. Somatization disorder was eliminated from the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and was superseded by somatic symptom disorder, which is defined this way. Somatic symptom disorder is a disorder characterized by one or more significant bodily symptoms, for example, pain, that cause distress or impair daily function, and by excessive maladaptive thoughts, rumination or preoccupation or excessive worry about the symptoms, with or without the presence of a medical condition to account for the symptoms included in the DSM. One of two, this diagnosis is one of two replacement diagnoses for hypochondriasis. Somatic symptom disorder is determined based only on this set of criteria and does not also apply to high health anxiety that occurs in the absence of significant somatic symptoms, for example, in illness anxiety disorder. In other words, what the dictionary is saying, you have general worry or anxiety about health conditions, and that is illness anxiety, and you have the same kind of background, anxiety and worry and so on, which manifest through the body, through bodily symptoms. Somatic symptom disorder also replaces such diagnosis as somatization disorder, requiring only one or two symptoms for diagnosis, rather than the much higher symptom count. So, 4 pain symptoms, 2 gastrointestinal symptoms, 1 sexual, 1 psychoneurological. Let's go back in history to the inevitable Sigmund Freud, who came up with the idea, or with the diagnosis of conversion disorder. In the 4th edition of the DSM, conversion disorder was described as a somatoform disorder in which patients present with one or more symptoms or deficits affecting voluntary, motor, and sensory functioning. And these symptoms suggest a physical disorder, but there is no evidence of a medical condition. Similarly, there is evidence instead of a psychological involvement. In other words, the physical symptoms are there, but there is no medical background, medical condition to justify them, only some kind of psychological involvement or psychological background. These conversion symptoms are not intentionally produced, says the dictionary. They're not feigned, and they're not under voluntary control. Symptoms in conversion disorder can include paralysis, loss of voice, blindness, seizures, globus pharyngeus, a lump in the throat, disturbance in coordination and balance, and loss of pain and touch sensations. Generally speaking, we distinguish between motor conversion symptoms and sensory conversion symptoms. I'll come to it in a minute. The formal criteria for the disorder in the 5th edition of the DSM refer to it as functional neurological symptom disorder. And they primarily emphasize that there must be clear clinical evidence of symptom incompatibility with recognized neurological pathology before we can make a diagnosis of FNsD, functional neurological symptom disorder, which is another name for conversion disorder. That there may also be psychological involvement in the onset of the symptoms, or that stress or trauma of any sort, either psychological or physical, may have etiological relevance, is recognized as among associated features that, if found, support diagnosis. The absence of faking, the absence of pretending, the absence of feigning, however, is no longer a required criterion for diagnosis due to the clinical challenge of reliably discerning its absence. So it seems that Sigmund Freud's conversion disorder, with its attendant conversion symptoms, has become enshrined and embedded in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but with an emphasis on a neurological background. The question is, are all these symptoms the outcomes of some true neurological dysfunction or deformity or abnormality, or in the absence of such an abnormality, are they the outcomes of stress and distress? Is there some psychological background or involvement? The DSM recognizes that conversion symptoms or functional neurological symptom disorder could be definitely the outcome or the consequence of stress, anxiety, distress, which are common reactions actually to abuse and trauma. So I'm giving you the background, the diagnostic background for what I'm going to say in the second part of the video. In the second part, I'm going to focus on you, how your body reacts to narcissistic abuse. But I want to ground it in the orthodoxy, in the mainstream psychiatric thinking. I mentioned that there are two types of conversion symptoms, two types of neurological dysfunctions. One is motor, one type is motor conversion symptoms, and the other type is sensory. We start with the motor conversion symptoms. The dictionary defines it as one of two types of symptoms of conversion disorder, the other being sensory conversion symptoms. Examples of motor conversion symptoms include impaired coordination and balance, paralysis or weakness confined to a specific area of the body or limb, difficulty in swallowing, aphonia, loss of voice, and urinary retention. Sensory conversion symptoms include loss of touch or pain sensation, double vision, blindness, deafness, tinnitus, and hallucinations. Let's go back a bit into much older history. As I mentioned, Wilhelm Stekel, who was a German psychoanalyst, was the first to introduce the term somatization. Another psychoanalyst, Paul Briquet, was the first to characterize what is now known as somatic symptom disorder. Briquet actually reported that several of his clients have been unwell most of their lives. They've been complaining of a variety of symptoms in various organ systems. And Briquet kept scheduling appointments, hospitalization, tests. Nothing has been discovered, and the symptoms continued. Briquet was forced into the conclusion, and we are talking now 19th century, Briquet was forced into the conclusion that there is something like a somatic symptom disorder, by the way, also known as Briquet syndrome. The conversion disorder came a bit later. It was a formally diagnosed psychiatric disorder. Initially, people reported abnormal sensory experiences and involuntary movement problems during periods of high psychological stress. It took Freud to realize the connection. Individuals diagnosed with conversion disorder presented with highly distressing neurological symptoms, and Freud was a neurologist. He noticed that these people report numbness, blindness, paralysis, convulsions, and he couldn't find an organic cause. He traced all of these to psychological triggers. Today we do the same when we diagnose functional neurological disorder, a similar diagnosis as I mentioned. However, in functional neurological disorder, in the 5th edition of the DSM, there is no need in the criteria, no need to prove that there is an antecedent psychological stressor. You could diagnose functional neurological disorder or neurologic disorder even in the absence of psychological stress, abuse, and trauma. That has not been the case with conversion disorder, where a psychological intrusion or invasion or trauma or abuse or whatever has been a necessary diagnostic criteria without which you could not diagnose conversion disorder. It is still, though, the mainstream thinking is still that functional neurologic disorder, the symptoms arise in response to stressful situations affecting the patient's mental health. Even though this condition has been removed, in actual clinical practice, it's proven time and again that patients somatize their stress, their anxiety, their tension, their dissonance, their abuse, their trauma, their uncertainty, their unpredictability, their terror. They somatize it. They convert all these. They speak through their bodies. They use their bodies to communicate this extreme discomfort and possibly fear. Individuals diagnosed with conversion disorder have a greater chance of experiencing other psychiatric disorders, such as anxiety disorders, mood disorders, personality disorders. So people with clean-cut neurological disorders are rarely comorbid. They rarely present with mental health issues. People with conversion symptoms amounting to a conversion disorder very typically also present with other mental health issues such as anxiety or depression, or even a reactive kind of personality disorder, situational personality disorder. So while the ICD-11 and the DSM-5 retained the essence of conversion disorder and renamed it functional neurological symptom disorder, as I said, FNsD, in the ICD, by the way, it's called dissociative neurological symptom disorder, introducing the element of dissociation, which is a major defense against trauma and abuse. We slice off the memory of trauma. We forget about it. We repress it. We bury it. That's dissociation. And so while these two diagnostic manuals actually retained most of Freud's work, most of the conversion symptoms, renamed the conversion disorder into something else, what they have done, especially the DSM, they have taken away the psychological anamnesis, the psychological background, the psychological etiology of the conversion disorder. And that's, in my view, a serious mistake. I think it's counterfactual, actually. In a desperate attempt to resemble medicine, psychology is dumping critical insights that have been accumulated over more than a century. FNsD covers a similar range of symptoms found in conversion disorder, as I said, and the dumping the requirement for psychological stress or stressors to be present is, in my view, wrong, as I just said as well. The new criteria also dispense with the issue of faking, or feigning, or pretending. You could fake and feign and pretend and still be diagnosed. And there is also an issue with sexual functioning. As you know, Freud was fixated on the sexual etiology of many problems and disorders in his patients. He first called it hysteria, then he used other names and so on. And echoes and traces of Freud's kind of obsession with sexual etiology do remain. In the fourth edition of the DSM, for example, one of the diagnostic criteria was a limitation in sexual functioning. This has been removed in the fifth edition of the DSM. The ICD-11 classifies it, as I mentioned, classifies dissociative neurological symptom disorder, DNSD, as a dissociative disorder with unspecified neurological symptoms. The ICD, therefore, is much closer to reality as usual and reflects the latest knowledge as usual. The DSM is antiquated and frequently wrong, frankly speaking. So the ICD recognizes that in response to trauma and abuse, one of the most typical reactions of the victim is to dissociate. And that this dissociation, this burying of the trauma, this repression of the trauma can erupt and manifest through the body, especially with all kinds of unspecified neurological symptoms. Conversion disorder in Freud's work and later work presented with symptoms following exposure to a certain stressor, typically associated with trauma or psychological distress. The physical symptoms of the disorder affected senses or motion, as I mentioned, movement. And common symptoms included blindness, partial or total paralysis, inability to speak, deafness, numbness, difficulty to swallowing, incontinence, balance problems, non-epileptic seizures, tremors, difficulty walking, you name it. These were all bodily manifestations. Today we know of many more. And for those of you who want to comprehend or were looking for a comprehensive list, I recommend that you watch the second part of this video dedicated specifically to narcissistic abuse. Phenomena such as shortness of breath, chest pains are also today indicated as a part of conversion disorder, part of a conversion symptom. Even sleep paralysis is today considered to be a conversion symptom. Both sleep paralysis and narcolepsy can be ruled out in sleep tests in a laboratory. And so when a neurological background is ruled out, what is left is a conversion symptom, something psychological. When a medical explanation fails, there's no medical explanation for the conditions, then what is left is Freud's work, the conversion, the idea of conversion. Symptoms of conversion disorder usually occur suddenly. Conversion disorder is typically observed in people between 10 and 35 and affects something like 0.5% of the general population. We are not talking about a small number. But all these numbers deal with endogenous symptom disorders. In other words, symptom disorders that are not reactive to the environment. Symptom disorders, for example, that are not the outcome of abuse or trauma and so on. I believe, although there are no definitive studies and no clear-cut evidence, I believe, anecdotally and from my 3 decades of experience working with victims of narcissistic abuse, I believe that the percentage of victims who somatize, who react with somatic symptoms, bodily symptoms to abuse and trauma is way higher than 0.5%. I would venture to say that they are the majority, actually. Conversion disorder is something that cannot be denied or ignored because so many victims have reported it over the years and decades. And conversion symptoms typically do not conform to any known anatomical pathway, physiological mechanism, biochemical knowledge. I mean, there's no way we can explain a conversion, classical, well-defined conversion symptom, except by realizing that there has been some psychological malfeasance, some abuse, some trauma, some torture. It is sometimes been stated that presenting symptoms tend to reflect the patient's own understanding of anatomy, and the less medical knowledge a person has, the more implausible and colorful the presenting symptoms. That may be true. It's not a substantiated claim. There's no proof of this. But there is some anecdotal evidence. And this makes the idea of conversion symptom even more compelling. The complaints of the patients who are victims of abuse and torture and distress and so on, the complaints are so outlandish, so not grounded in medical knowledge, that clearly whatever is happening in their bodies has nothing to do with a medical condition. It's a psychological condition. Sexual dysfunction and pain, vaginismus and so on, were also considered symptoms of conversion disorder. But if a patient only has these symptoms, they should be diagnosed as sexual pain disorder or pain disorder. So this alone is not enough. And this is, of course, where Freud initially was wrong. Let's go back to functional neurologic disorder or functional neurological disorder. Again, as I mentioned, it's a condition where the patients experience neurological symptoms, weakness, movement problems, sensory symptoms, convulsions, you name it. It's a functional disorder, as the name implies. So by definition, no known disease process affecting the structure or the functioning of the body exists. And yet, the person experiences symptoms related to body functioning and keep complaining. Symptoms of this kind of disorder, functional neurological disorders, are typically clinically recognizable but are not categorically associated with any definable organic, biochemical, or physiological disease. So there is a contrast here between functional neurological problems and organic brain syndromes or traumatic brain injury, where the pathology, the disease process, which affects the body's physiology, can be identified. It is very lamentable that medical doctors and psychiatrists reject the accounts of victims of abuse, pathologize them with some concocted cockamamie medical condition and send them home with pills. It's very, very wrong to do that. To refuse to recognize the psychological background of symptom disorders or somatic symptom disorders is wrong, both diagnostically but also as a practice. We invalidate the victim by converting her into a malingerer or a faker or into someone with a recognized neurological condition, which does not exist. In the vast majority of cases of victims of abuse, medical tests yield nothing. And there's no reason to insist on reductionism. Everything is the brain. Everything is the body. Yes, it manifests through the body. Yes, it involves the brain, but it's not reducible to either. It's a psychological condition, holistic. And so today victims get very little succor and help and understanding and acceptance from the medical professions because there is a refusal to acknowledge, there is a denial of the pathway between psychology and body, mind and body. It's as if the mind is nothing but a bodily function, when manifestly and expressly and patently it's not. It cannot be reduced to the body only. It can work through the body, it can talk, the mind can talk through the body, the mind can manifest through the body, but it's not concomitant, it's not coextant, it's not the same as the body. There are subsets of functional neurological disorders, which include functional movement disorders and functional seizures and functional sensory disorders. It's all very true. And yes, the doctor, the medical doctor, the psychiatrist, who is also a medical doctor, they have to invest a lot of effort in testing, eliminating, diagnosing, writing down anamnesis, exploring like detectives the etiology, perusing the symptoms, constructing all kinds of tests to see how the patient functions in a variety of settings and circumstances and environments and reactions to other people and so on. They have to work hard. They have to work hard because conversion symptom is a simulation. Conversion disorder is a simulation. It's an imitation. The patient cannot verbalize sufficiently or doesn't dare to acknowledge or to be conscious of what is happening to her, the abuse, the trauma. The patient denies the abuse and trauma. And so this hidden, buried, repressed knowledge has to manifest somehow, has to be communicated somehow, has to erupt somehow. And what the patient does, she imitates other conditions which are medical and have nothing to do with trauma and abuse, thereby trying to convince herself that the problem is not trauma, the problem is not abuse, the problem is her brain, the problem is her spine, the problem is whatever. Her body is the problem. It's a form of autoplastic defense. It's like the patient says, nothing bad is happening to me, nothing wrong. I'm being treated fairly and squarely and nicely, and you know, it's my problem. I'm the one. I'm guilty. I'm to blame. My body is wrong, is working, in all the wrong ways. I'm defective. I'm deformed. I am the core of the problem, not the solution. And so it is displacing the blame and the guilt, shifting it to the victim. And the victim is the one who is doing this via somatic symptom disorders. It's as if the victim is assuming the responsibility and the accountability for the abuse, internalizing it, digesting it, and letting it poison poison her body. And the body rebels. The body not only keeps the score, but it rebels. Somatic symptom disorders is a rebellion, an eruption of the body against this unjustified assumption of responsibility for being mistreated, for being abused, for being traumatized, for being tortured, for being tormented. There's a great number. The problem with conversion disorders and somatic symptom disorders is the number of symptoms is huge, because the patients or the victims are very creative, and any part of the body, any organ, any system, any limb, any surface area, anything can serve as a communication channel. Anything can be recruited to express the inexpressible, to communicate and discuss the horror of abuse and trauma. So the number of symptoms is literally unlimited in functional neurological disorders, in conversion disorders, somatic symptom disorders. The symptoms are very real. They're experienced as real. They have adverse outcomes, adverse impacts on the body. But the origin, the etiology is much more complex, because it involves a dominant component, dominant ingredient of psychology, severe psychological trauma. The neurological dysfunction is idiopathic, but the etiology is very often psychological. The core symptoms are sensory and motoric, but they still try to somehow symbolically communicate the trauma and abuse background, which was Freud's initial insight, that it is a language actually. So limb weakness, paralysis, non-epileptic seizures, movement disorders, tremors, dystonia, spasms, myoclonus, jerky movements, loss of vision, double vision, dysphonia, whispering speech, slurred or stuttering speech, sensory disturbances, hemisensory syndrome, altered sensation down one side of the body, numbness, inability to sense touch, dizziness, balance problems, pain, extreme slowness and fatigue, etc., etc., and of course sleep disorders. It's an endless array and require very lengthy and profound investigations, which many doctors eschew because they don't want to. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to be invested. They want to dispense pills and collect the commission on the side, of course. Stressful life events and childhood neglect were found time and again in numerous systematic reviews and meta-analysis, time and again, to be significantly more common in patients with functional neurological disorders than in the general population. Patients with functional neurological disorder conversion disorders, somatic symptom disorder, call it as you will. Patients with somatization, with somatic symptoms, there is almost invariably a background of adverse childhood experiences, stressful life events, childhood neglect, childhood abuse. Even when the patients report counterfactually and erroneously no stressors, they have buried and denied what's happening to them to the extent that they're happy-go-lucky. They say, my partner is the best partner in the world, when we're talking about a narcissist, an abusive narcissist. Or, I'm to blame, I'm constantly sick and so on. He's a saint for having stayed with me. And they deny. There's a lot of denial. Denial, of course, is a psychological defense mechanism. Somatic symptom disorder, somatoform disorder, somatization disorder, it's chronic in conditions of abuse and trauma. As long as the abuse and trauma continue, the somatic reaction is likely to endure. And it involves not only the body. In the majority of cases of somatization, we find excessive and maladaptive thoughts, emotions, behaviors connected to these symptoms. It's some maladaptations. The symptoms are not deliberately produced, they're not feigned, they're not faked, and they don't coexist with a medical ailment. So they go hand in hand with cognitive impairment, cognitive distortions, emotional dysregulation, all the parameters and clinical features of personality disorders, for example, cluster B. Manifestations of somatic symptom disorders are variable. Symptoms can be widespread, specific, fluctuate. I mentioned this before, but they correspond to the way an individual views and reacts to symptoms rather than to the symptoms themselves. The individual who is subjected to torture and abuse and trauma on a recurrent basis, there's no escape, the individual develops a relationship with the symptoms, a relationship with the body, because the symptoms are relief valves. They allow the individual to obtain relief from the impossible environmental conditions. The symptoms become friends while the body becomes the enemy. It's a very bizarre triangle where the patient encourages the symptoms, hones the symptoms, dotes on the symptoms, loves the symptoms, nurtures them, develops them, elaborates them, and so on, even as the patient resents her body for tormenting her and putting her through all the symptoms that she has to endure. The body, therefore, becomes unconsciously identified with the abuser, whereas the symptoms become unconsciously identified with the victim. And it is this dichotomy between relatedness to the body and relationship with the symptoms, which is the greatest diagnostic and clinical indication of a symptom disorder. Somatic symptom disorders may develop, of course, also in people who have chronic illnesses or medical conditions and so on, but we should always rule out, we should always study and ask and insist on ascertaining whether there is a psychological background, whether there is something behind the scenes that may provide a better explanation than the medical condition. To wrap it up, in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, somatoform disorders have been modified, and now they are called somatic symptom and related disorders. There are other modifications. The criteria in the DSM-5 involve one or more somatic symptoms which are distressing or result in substantial impairment of daily life. The B criteria include excessive thoughts, feelings, or behaviors regarding somatic symptoms or corresponding health concerns, manifested by disproportionate and persistent thoughts about the severity of one's symptoms. Although any one somatic symptom might not be consistently present, one's state of being symptomatic is continuous and typically lasting more than 6 months. The DSM-5 includes 5 descriptions, 5 distinctions of somatic symptom disorders. These include somatic symptom disorder with predominant pain, which used to be called pain disorder, by the way, as well as classifications for mild, moderate, severe symptoms, and so on. You can find all this in the DSM-5. The International Classification of Diseases includes bodily distress disorder, which bears similarities to somatic symptom disorder. So bodily distress disorder involves somatic symptoms, but it appears to be more strongly associated with the experience of physical symptoms, whereas somatic symptom disorder is more closely linked to psychological distress. So in the ICD-11, bodily distress disorder is actually probably some kind of neurological or medical condition. And therefore, we should not use bodily distress disorder to diagnose conversion disorder. If we want to do that, we can use somatic symptom disorder in the DSM-5 or other diagnoses in the ICD-11. Patients that meet the criteria for both diagnoses tend to exhibit greater symptom severity across various psychosocial domains. So, this is where we stand nowadays. As I mentioned, studies have found comorbidities, especially with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, phobias, and so on and so forth. Somatic symptom disorder and functional pain syndromes like fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, and so on. They're all very common dual diagnoses. And it all leads to poor functioning, interpersonal issues, unemployment, problems at work, financial strain, excessive healthcare visitations. It all leads to pervasive dysfunction in the life of the patient or the victim of abuse. The cause, the etiology of somatic symptom disorder is still hotly debated. As I said, maybe in some cases there is a heightened awareness of specific physical sensations. In other cases, there's a problem with the interpretation of experiences as signs of medical ailment, what used to be called hypochondriasis or illness anxiety. But still the majority, they have a psychological background. And to ignore this psychological background would be wrong. One of the key features of somatic symptom disorder is the inconsistent history of symptoms. The patient complains, the victim of abuse complains, makes one type of complaint on Wednesday and another type of complaint on Friday, and sometimes they're mutually exclusive. The symptoms are in flux all the time. They're protean, they keep changing shape and face and presentation. And this can never happen in a true medical condition. Additional signs include interpreting normal sensations for medical ailments, avoiding physical activity or constriction, being disproportionately sensitive to medication side effects, and seeking medical care from several physicians for the same concerns. Manifestation of somatic symptom disorder are very variable. So recurrent ailments usually begin and then abate and then begin again with totally different symptoms. Most patients have a multiplicity of symptoms to choose from. It's like a library. They lend different books at different times. Others experience only one symptom consistently. And again, probably, there's a psychological background for this. The severity fluctuates, but the symptoms rarely go away completely for long periods of time. Symptoms might be specific, regional pain, localized sensations, or they might be general, fatigue, muscle aches, malaise, you name it. The sufferers, the victims, the patients experience recurring and obsessive feelings, rumination, constant thoughts concerning their own well-being. And these thoughts escalate all the time. There's an element of catastrophizing, negative affectivity. And so severe anxiety sets in, and it leads to misinterpretation of normal sensations as severe illness. There is a belief that the symptoms are dangerous and life-threatening. even when doctors tell the patient that there's no such thing. Uh, Many patients develop paranoid ideation. They claim that medical doctors and medical evaluations and medical treatment have been inadequate or criminally negligent, and they fear that engaging in physical activity will harm the body, or spending a disproportionate amount of time um, thinking about the symptoms while avoiding actual medication. Somatic symptom disorders pertains to how an individual interprets and responds to symptoms, not to the symptoms themselves. It is therefore a form of cognitive distortion, which of course is very common in victims of abuse. Cognitive distortion is one of the main mechanisms that victims of abuse deploy and employ in order to cope with their impossible condition, with the entrapment, the trap they found themselves in. Somatic symptom disorders can occur um, and do occur whenever the patient feels the need to rearrange reality, to reframe it, to build an alternative theory about the world, about the intimate partner, about relationships in general, and so on. In this process of reconstructing cognition and cognitive processes, in this process, cognitive distortion is a distinct possibility. When you're trying to make sense of senseless abuse, of meaningless trauma, of crazy making, of acting out, of insanity, when trying to make sense of all this, of the misbehavior of your intimate partner, of uncertainty and predictability, intermittent reinforcement, fantasy, crazy situations, maternal projections, when you're trying to make sense of all this, you're bound to get some things wrong. And when you get these things wrong, you engage in cognitive distortions. You're losing your reality testing, becomes impaired, and the general idea is to provide relief from anxiety. This kind of approach is anxiolytic. It reduces dissonance by falsifying reality, in effect. The reality out there and the reality in here with your body. So these patients are usually unresponsive to treatment and they're usually unresponsive and unusually sensitive to the side effects of drugs. People with somatic symptom disorder um, experience significant impairment. Even when they have a medical condition, their reaction to the medical condition is hyperbolic and exaggerated. So I want to make clear, all studies show that such people have a background of childhood trauma, insecure attachment, negative psychological factors, catastrophizing, negative affectivity, rumination, avoidance, health anxiety, and a poor physical self-concept. And all these psychological factors have a significant impact and in the development of problematic somatic symptoms up to the point of debilitation, paralysis. Somatic symptom disorder always escalates as long as there is exposure to the psychological triggers like abuse and trauma. The only way is to remove the victim or to remove the patient from the traumatizing and abusive environment. People who experience more negative psychological characteristics inevitably regard medically unexplained symptoms to be more threatening. They exhibit stronger cognitive, emotional, and behavioral awareness of these symptoms, and they tend to falsify reality, falsify their relationship with their own body, lie, reframe. Self-deception is a critical feature in this. Evidence suggests that negative psychological factors have a significant impact on the impairments and behaviors of people suffering from somatic symptom disorder, as well as long-term stability of these symptoms. So this is the general background. Now let's head into the second part of this video, which deals with how specifically narcissistic abuse typically affects your body. I can't say have fun. My name is Sam Baknin. I'm a professor of psychology and the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and a series of other books and ebooks about personality disorders, philosophy, and allied topics. I was very surprised recently when I found out that there's a lot of material online, innumerable videos and texts and articles and papers and on various forms of abuse, such as sexual abuse and sexual assault, verbal abuse, mental abuse, psychological abuse, even financial abuse and legal abuse. But there's very little of substance in depth about physical abuse, battering, assault, physical assault. And so I rushed to the breach. And in today's video, I will try to deal with two issues. The first one, what are the effects of physical abuse on the intimate partner, on the victim? And the second question is, how does society react to physical abuse, battering, and physical assault when it is within the confines of the dyad, when it is within a couple, when it's in a marriage? So issues such as marital rape, a pretty novel idea. Only in the past few decades did we come to the realization that rape can take place inside a marriage. Issues such as where is the boundary, where's the limit between a reasonable expected expression of physical aggression and physical assault? Is there such a thing? Is there a legitimate way to express physical aggression? What if I break objects, smash things? Is that okay? Etc., etc. So how society views this issue is the second part of the video. The first part of the video is the most recent knowledge about how physical abuse affects the battered, the assaulted party. And I would like to start with a quote from one of my favorite authors on the topic. He wrote a seminal essay called Understanding the Batterer in Visitation and Custody Disputes. His name is Lundy Bancroft, and he sums up the asymmetry in favor of the offender. And this is what he says. Batterers, people who physically assault others, batterers adopt the role of a hurt, sensitive man who does not understand how things got so bad and just wants to work it all out for the good of the children. This man may cry and use language that demonstrates considerable insight into his own feelings. He is likely to be skilled at explaining how other people have turned the victim against him and how she is denying him access to the children as a form of revenge. The batterer commonly accuses her, his intimate partner, of having mental health problems and may state that her family and friends agree with him, that she is hysterical and that she is promiscuous. The abuser tends to be comfortable lying, having years of practice, and so can sound believable when making baseless statements. The abuser benefits when professionals believe that they can just tell who is lying and who is telling the truth. And so these professionals fail to adequately investigate. Because of the effects of trauma, the victim of battering will often seem hostile, disjointed, and agitated, while the abuser appears to be friendly, articulate, and calm. Evaluators are thus tempted to conclude that the victim is the source of the problems in the relationship. End quote. Lundy Bancroft. Go online and find anything he has ever written. But physical abuse, physical assault, including sexual assault, if it is very violent and aggressive, what does it do to the victim? What does it do to the affected party? I'm not going to focus on trauma, PTSD, CPTSD. There are other videos that I've made which deal with this aspect. Trauma is a delayed reaction. It's not immediate. Trauma is the outcome of processing the assault, processing the violation of one's boundaries, or processing the invasion, and processing the humiliation, in some ways, narcissistic injury or mortification to the individual. So trauma is a delayed reaction. Nor is trauma universal. Many people do not get traumatized. So trauma is highly idiosyncratic, highly specific to certain individuals with predisposition for trauma. I've discussed all this in other videos. Today what I want to discuss is what physical abuse does to the relationship between the victim and her body. There is one place in which one's privacy, intimacy, integrity, and inviolability are guaranteed. It's one's body. One's body is a unique temple, a shrine, a familiar territory of sensory input, and personal history. What happens? The assaulter, the batterer, the torturer, because let's call a spade a spade. Repeated continuous physical abuse and sexual abuse, aggressive, violent sexual abuse, and physical abuse, physical assault, that are coupled with intimidation, intermittent reinforcement, trauma bonding, a hostage Stockholm syndrome situation. This is torture. This is exactly what torturers do on behest of governments when they torture, I don't know, terrorism suspects. Torture is exactly this: the confluence, the congruence, and the collusion of a psychological dimension and a physical dimension, where the physical is a mere reification or manifestation or expression of implied psychological signaling and messaging. You are a nothing. You are a non-entity. You have no boundaries and no protection from me. I can invade you at any time. I can do anything I want to you. It's a horror film. And so I'm going to use the word torture, if you don't mind. The assaulter, the batterer, the torturer invades, defiles, desecrates this shrine, the body. And he does it usually publicly. Most domestic violence and family violence takes place in the presence of witnesses, usually children, but not only children, parents of the assaulted party, friends of the assaulted party, family of the assaulted party, neighbors. So most of these attacks take place publicly, deliberately, repeatedly, and often sadistically, and involve usually some sexual dimension, or at least erotic dimension. They contain an element of undisguised pleasure. It's not the pleasure in attacking the other party. It's not the pleasure in causing pain. That would be pure sadism. It's the pleasure of omnipotence. It's the pleasure in establishing a power hierarchy, a power matrix. The torturer, the abuser, the harasser, the batterer, he's on top. He's top dog. It's the submissiveness of the victim that turns him on. It's a power play, exactly like rape. Rape is not about sex. It's about power. And so there's an all-pervasive, long-lasting, and frequently irreversible effects and outcomes, both to the victim and, equally importantly, to the abuser. Because physical abuse is habituating. It triggers a dopamine loop in the brain. It causes pleasure. Omnipotence is a pleasurable experience. And so the abuser wants more. He is incentivized by his own brain to abuse even more and more. In a way, the torture victim's own body is rendered her worst enemy. You see, it's the abuser, it's the attacker that causes the pain, but the corporeal agony is experienced by the body. And in a way, the victim begins to resent her body. It's very childish. There's a lot of magical thinking here, primitive thinking. It's like the abuser is angry at the body, resents the body. Why do you cause me pain? Why don't you resist the abuse effectively by not causing me pain? It's this agony that compels the sufferer to mutate. The identity of the victim fragments. Her ideals and principles crumble. The body becomes an accomplice of the tormentor, accomplice of the abuser. They both work together to cause the victim pain, agony. It is an uninterruptible channel of communication to the victim. It's a treasonous, poison territory. The body becomes a fifth column, a traitor. And so this fosters a humiliating dependency of the abused victim on the perpetrator. She becomes dependent on the perpetrator. You see, in most cases of domestic violence and family violence, bodily needs are denied. For example, many victims of physical abuse will tell you that they are afraid to go to sleep. They're afraid to fall asleep. Many of them avoid going to the toilet because they're afraid to emerge to the unknown, to the unpredictable, to the capricious and arbitrary and horror-like film, disjointed reality. Many of them forego food because meals, family meals, are usually trigger for physical assault. So many bodily needs, the victim denies her bodily needs, and they are wrongly perceived by the victim as the direct causes of her degradation and dehumanization. As she sees it, she's rendered bestial, she's rendered animalistic, not by the sadistic bully, her spouse or her boyfriend or whoever it is, not by the sadistic bully, but by her own flesh and blood. Her own body betrays her, turns on her, turns against her. She can't trust her body anymore. There's a relationship of mistrust and distrust. The very concept of body can easily be extended to family or to home. Torture is often applied not only to the spouse, but to kin and kith, to children, to the children, to, the spouse's parents, her brother, siblings, whatever, even colleagues. And the typical physical batterer, the typical abuser, intends to disrupt the continuity of surroundings, habits, appearance, relations with others. This quote that I just used is from the CIA. The CIA, being the savory organization that it is, published a manual about torture, where it advises torturers and tormentors how to disrupt the continuity and therefore the identity of the victim. A sense of cohesive self-identity depends crucially on the familiar, on the benevolent, on the continuous. You have to believe that people around you are essentially good. Yes, they can behave immorally, they can make mistakes, they can even sometimes deceive you or betray you, but essentially they're good. This belief is very often counterfactual when it comes to the abuser. The abuser is not good, is malicious, malevolent. By attacking both one's physical body and one's social body, the victim's psyche is strained to the point of dissociation and breaking. There's a scholar by the name of Beatrice Patsalides, and she describes this transmogrification in her essay, Ethics of the Unspeakable, Torture Survivors in Psychoanalytic Treatment. She writes, I'm quoting, as the gap between the I and the me deepens, dissociation and alienation increase. The subject that under torture was forced into the position of a pure object has lost her sense of interiority, intimacy, and privacy. Time is experienced now in the present only, and perspective, that which allows for a sense of relativity, is foreclosed. Thoughts and dreams attack the mind and invade the body, as if the protective skin that normally contains our thoughts gives us space to breathe in between the thought and the thing being thought about. As if this skin separates. The skin falls away. It separates between the inside and the outside, the past and the present, the me and the you. And this skin was lost. Torture robs the victim of the most basic, end of quote, yeah. Torture robs the victim of the most basic modes of relating to reality. It is the equivalent of cognitive death. Space and time are warped by, for example, sleep deprivation and by the lack of predictability. We perceive our surroundings, our environment, via habits and via models in the brain, models of cause and effect. A leads to B. If I do X, I will get Y. Physical assault, physical battering, they disrupt this continuity. They disrupt the rationality. They disrupt the reason behind the world. The world becomes, to use Jordan Peterson's term, chaotic. There's chaos. The self, the I, is shattered. The tortured party have nothing familiar to hold on to. Not family, not home, not personal belongings, not loved ones, not language even. Some abusers, physical abusers, react when the victim uses her name. It seems to trigger them for some reason. Gradually, the victims lose their mental resilience, their sense of freedom and who they are. They feel alien, unable to communicate, unable to relate, to attach, to empathize with other people. There's a marked decline in empathy, by the way, among torture victims. It's very similar to people with chronic illness. Chronic illness is also perceived to be an attack on the body. COVID-19 is an attack on your body with which your body is collaborating. Torture splinters early childhood grandiose narcissistic fantasies of uniqueness, omnipotence, invulnerability, impenetrability, and most importantly, lovability, that you can be loved. But physical assault enhances the fantasy of merger with an idealized and omnipotent, though not benign, other, the inflictor of the agony. That's the sad irony. Trauma bonding, Stockholm syndrome. It's a sad irony. The more you're tortured, the more you're bullied, the more you're physically attacked, the more you're hurt, the more you're wounded, the more you end up in hospital, the more you get attached to the person who is doing this to you. The twin processes of individuation and separation are reversed by physical assault, because it's like the bodies merge. The body of your attacker and your body are collaborating. They become a single organism, single entity of pain. Torture is the ultimate act of perverted intimacy. The torturer invades the victim's body, pervades her psyche, possesses her mind. Deprived of contact with others, starved for human interactions. Typically, the prey, the victim, bonds with the only person around, the predatory assaulter, the predatory attacker, her abuser. Traumatic bonding, akin to Stockholm syndrome, is about hope, actually. It's about the search for meaning in the brutal and indifferent and nightmarish universe of the torture cell, usually the family unit. So the abuser becomes like a black hole at the center of the victim's surrealistic galaxy. The abuser sucks in the victim's universal need for solace, her suffering. He feeds on her suffering. The victim tries to control her tormentor, to control the attacker, by becoming one with him, by merging and fusing with him, by introjecting him, and by appealing to the monster's presumably dormant humanity and empathy. And this bonding is especially strong when the torturer and the tortured form a dyad, when they're really attached to each other. It's a common myth that stalkers, abusers, batterers, and so on are not attached to their prey. They are even more attached than in a typical relationship. Hate, aggression are a glue that is stronger than love. And so the bonding is very strong, and the dyad is very powerful. And so the victim seeks to collaborate in the rituals and acts and ceremonies of torture. For example, when the victim is coerced, sometimes, into selecting the torture implements and the types of torment to be inflicted, or to choose between two evils, or to participate in sex acts that she finds abhorrent and painful. The psychologist Shirley Spitz offers this powerful overview of the contradictory nature of torture in a seminar titled The Psychology of Torture in 1989. I'm quoting, "Torture is an obscenity in that it joins what is most private with what is most public. Torture entails all the isolation and the extreme solitude of privacy, with none of the usual security embodied therein. Torture entails at the same time all the self-exposure of the utterly public, with none of its possibilities for camaraderie or shared experience. The presence of an all-powerful other with whom to merge without the security of the other's benign intentions. A further obscenity of torture is the inversion it makes of intimate human relationships. The interrogation is a form of social encounter in which the normal rules of communicating, of relating, of intimacy are manipulated. Dependency and its needs are elicited by the interrogator, by the abuser, by the attacker, by the assaulter. But not so they may be met as in close relationship, but in order to weaken and confuse. Independence that is offered in return for betrayal is a lie. Silence is intentionally misinterpreted either as confirmation of information or as guilt for complicity. Torture combines complete humiliating exposure with utter devastating isolation. The final products and outcomes of torture are a scarred and often shattered victim and an empty display of the fiction of power." End quote. Obsessed by endless ruminations, demented by pain and a continuum of sleeplessness, the victim regresses, goes back to childhood, shedding all but the most primitive defense mechanisms: splitting, narcissism, dissociation, projective identification, introjection, and cognitive dissonance. All the rest are deleted. In other words, physical assault, battery, induces what we call decompensation. The victim constructs an alternative world, often suffering from depersonalization and derealization, amnesiac dissociation, hallucinations, ideas of reference, delusions, and even psychotic episodes. Sometimes the victim comes to crave pain masochistically, very much as self-mutilators do, because it is a proof and a reminder of her individuated existence, otherwise blurred by the incessant torture. In other words, the more physically you are attacked, the more you are raped, the more you are abused, battered, broken, beaten, the more sometimes you get addicted to the pain, the more you crave the pain, because it's only when you are in pain, in agony, in anguish, that you feel alive. The rest of the time you feel dead or suspended or disanimated somehow, in a vegetative state, comatose. Pain wakes you up. Pain shields the sufferer from disintegration and capitulation. It keeps you alive and resistant. It enhances resilience. It preserves the veracity of her unthinkable and unspeakable experiences. It proves to you that you are right. The abuser is wrong. Pain is a certificate of virtue. This dual process of the victim's alienation and addiction to anguish, this process complements the perpetrator's view of his quarry as inhuman or subhuman. The abuser, the attacker, the torturer assumes a position of the sole authority, the exclusive fount and source of meaning and interpretation, the fountainhead of evil and good, godlike. Torture is about reprogramming the victim to succumb to an alternative interpretation, exegesis of the world. The abuser comes to the victim. The attacker, the batterer, the beater, the wife beater comes to the victim and says, listen, I'm going to use your body to alter your mind. It is an act of deep, indelible, traumatic indoctrination, brainwashing. The abused, the victim, also swallows whole and assimilates her attacker's, her abuser's negative view of her, and often as a result is rendered suicidal, self-destructive, self-defeating. So torture has no cutoff date. Once you are physically assaulted, even in a single incident, by the way, let alone over many years, the sounds, the voices, the smells, the sensations, the emotions attendant on that incident reverberate in your mind like in an echo chamber long after the episode had ended. You experience nightmares, but also in waking moments. The victim's ability to trust other people, to assume that their motives are at least rational, if not necessarily benign. This trust is irrevocably undermined, shattered, broken. Social institutions are perceived as precariously poised on the verge of an ominous, Kafkaesque mutation. And when I say social institutions, I mean also the family. Nothing is either safe or credible anymore. Victims typically react by undulating, oscillating between emotional numbing and increased arousal. Insomnia, irritability, restlessness, attention deficits, these are not the result of numbing. On the contrary, they are the result of an excitatory state, adrenaline-infused body, fight or flight, or freeze, or fawn. Recollections of the traumatic events intrude in the form of dreams, night terrors, flashbacks, distressing associations. The victim, the tortured, develop compulsive rituals to fend off obsessive thoughts, intrusive thoughts. Other psychological sequelae reported include cognitive impairment, reduced capacity to learn. I'm talking about the victim, yeah? After she's habitually sexually molested, physically attacked, or both. So she develops cognitive impairment, reduced capacity to learn, memory disorders, sexual dysfunction, social withdrawal, inability to maintain long-term relationships or even mere intimacy, phobias like agoraphobias, ideas of reference and superstitions, delusions, hallucinations, psychotic microepisodes, and emotional flatness. Depression and anxiety, of course, are very common. These are forms and manifestations of self-directed aggression. Victim is very angry at herself for having placed herself in the tortured chamber. The sufferer rages at her own victimhood and the resulting multiple dysfunctions. She feels ashamed by her new disabilities, and she feels responsible or somehow even guilty for her predicament and the dire consequences borne by her nearest and dearest. Her sense of self-worth and self-esteem are crippled, sometimes for good. In a nutshell, victims of physical assault suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, if the assault takes place over a protracted period of time and there are many repeated incidents. Their strong feelings of anxiety, guilt, and shame are also typical of victims of childhood abuse, domestic violence of other forms, and rape. These victims feel anxious because the perpetrator's behavior is seemingly arbitrary and unpredictable, or mechanically and inhumanly regular, robotic. Victims feel guilty and disgraced because to restore a semblance of order to their shattered world and a modicum of dominion over their chaotic lives, the victims need to transform themselves into the cause of their own degradation and the accomplices of their tormentors. They lie to themselves. They say, all this happened to me I made it happen. I was the cause. I provoked him. I provoked him. That's why he's misbehaving. And you remember the videos I've made about mortification. Sometimes when you can't accept, when you cannot accept that you had been victimized, you compensate by telling yourself, I have been victimized justly. I deserved it. I had it coming. I made it happen. It's that way you cheat yourself, you deceive yourself into believing that you're in control. The aforementioned charitable organization, the CIA, in its Human Resource Exploitation Training Manual, dated 1983 and reprinted in the April 1997 issue of Harper's Magazine, summed up the theory of coercion this way. Mind you, it's the CIA. The purpose of all coercive techniques is to induce psychological regression in the subject by bringing a superior outside force to bear on her will to resist. Regression is basically a loss of autonomy, a reversion to an earlier behavioral level. As the subject regresses, her learned personality traits fall away in reverse chronological order. She begins to lose the capacity to carry out the highest creative activities, to deal with complex situations, or to cope with stressful interpersonal relationships or repeated frustrations. Trust the CIA to get it right. Inevitably, in the aftermath of physical assault or torture, the victims feel helpless, powerless, impotent, and this loss of control over one's life and body is manifested physically, sometimes in erectile dysfunction or impotence, vaginismus, attention deficits, insomnia. And this is often exacerbated by the disbelief of many victims, torture victims, physical abuse victims, battering victims. Victims encounter disbelief when they try to recount their experiences, when they try to describe what had happened to them. They are not believed. They're rejected, especially if they are unable to produce scars and show scars or other objective proof of their ordeal. This happens a lot to rape victims. Language cannot communicate such an intensely private experience as pain. Back to Spitz, she makes the following observation. Pain is also unshareable, cannot be shared, in that it is resistant to language. All our interior states of consciousness, emotional, perceptual, cognitive, and somatic, can be described as having an object in the external world. This affirms our capacity to move beyond the boundaries of our body into the external shareable world. This is the space in which we interact and communicate with our environment. But when we explore the interior state of physical pain, we find that there is no object out there, no external referential content. Pain is not of or for anything. Pain is. And it draws us away from the space of interaction, the shareable world, inwards. It draws us into the boundaries of our own body. And so bystanders, observers, resent the tortured victim, resent the victim because the victim makes them feel guilty and ashamed for having done nothing to prevent the atrocity. The victims threaten people's sense of security and their much needed belief in predictability, justice, rule of law, and the benevolence of people. The victims, on their part, don't believe that it is possible to effectively communicate to outsiders what they have been through. So there's a gulf, there's an abyss between the two. The torture chambers, the family setting where violence took place, the marital or the conjugal bed where you've been raped, that's another galaxy. This is how Auschwitz was described by the author Katzetnik in his testimony in the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961. Kenneth Pope, in Torture, a chapter he wrote for the Encyclopedia of Women and Gender, Sex Similarities and Differences and the Impact of Society on Gender. So in this encyclopedia, in the article on torture, he quotes Harvard psychiatrist Judith Herman, the woman who came up with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So Herman says, it is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator, of the abuser. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. The abuser appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. You know the three monkeys? The victim, on the contrary, is asking the bystander to share the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, remembering. People don't want that. But more often, continued attempts to repress fearful memories result in psychosomatic illnesses. This is known as a conversion symptom. The victim wishes to forget the assault, to forget the rape, to forget the torture, to avoid re-experiencing the often life-threatening abuse, and to shield her human environment from the horrors. She doesn't tell her children. She doesn't share with her parents or with her siblings or with her friends or with her neighbors or colleagues. She hides her scars and the wounds, you know, the famous sunglasses, the famous long sleeves, the famous conspicuous scarves that physical abuse victims wear. In conjunction with the victim's pervasive distrust, this is frequently interpreted as hypervigilance or even paranoia. It seems that the victims cannot win. Torture is forever. It is telling that precious few psychology and psychopathology textbooks dedicate an entire chapter to abuse and violence. Yes, it's a fact. Few psychology and textbooks have a chapter on violence and abuse. Even the most egregious manifestations, such as child sexual abuse, merit a fleeting mention, usually as a subchapter, sometimes a footnote, in a larger section dedicated to paraphilias or personality disorders. Abusive behavior did not make it into the diagnostic criteria of mental health disorders. And the psychodynamic, cultural, and social roots of abuse were never explored in depth. As a result of this deficient education and lacking awareness and denial, most law enforcement officers, policemen, cops, judges, counselors, guardians, evaluators, mediators, they are worryingly ignorant about the phenomenon of abuse and especially physical abuse. Only 4%, you heard it right, 4% of hospital emergency room admissions of women in the United States are attributed by staff to domestic violence. The true figure, according to the FBI, is 50%. So half of all women who are admitted to emergency rooms in hospitals were physically assaulted, raped, and battered. Half. But the staff of the hospital misclassifies them and attributes only 4% to domestic violence. 1 in 3 murdered women was done in by her spouse, current or former. The US Department of Justice pegs the number of spouses, mostly women, threatened with a deadly weapon at almost 2 million annually. Domestic violence erupts in a mind-boggling half of all American homes, at least once a year. And these are not isolated out of the blue incidents. Mistreatment and violence are part of an enduring pattern of maladaptive behavior within the relationship. They are sometimes coupled with substance abuse. Abusers are possessive, pathologically jealous, dependent, and often narcissistic. Invariably, both the abuser and his victim, they seek to conceal the abusive episodes and their aftermath from family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, or authorities. And this dismal state of things is an abuser's and stalker's paradise. This is especially true with psychological, verbal, and emotional abuse, which leaves no visible marks and renders the victim incapable of coherence. And so there's no typical offender, that's true. Maltreatment crosses racial, cultural, social, and economic lines. And this is because until very recently, abuse has constituted a normative, socially acceptable, condoned behavior. It was okay to abuse. In the law of the land in the United Kingdom, there were measurements as to the size of the stick that the husband can use to beat up his wife. Kidding you not. Abuse, physical abuse against children and against spouse are still an integral part of many cultures and societies. For example, in Russia, they removed the law. They had a law and they got rid of it, a domestic violence law, because they say it's okay for a husband to beat up his wife. It's part of the socialization process. In many Muslim countries, beating up women is an acceptable practice, and children. For the bulk of human history, women and children were considered no better than property, chattel. Indeed, well into the 18th century, women and children still made it into lists of assets and liabilities of the household. 1 bed, 2 desks, 1 woman, 3 children. Early legislation in America, fashioned after European law, both Anglo-Saxon and continental, permitted wife battering for the purpose of behavior modification. The circumference of the stick used, specified the statute, should not exceed that of the husband's thumb. Inevitably, many victims blame themselves for the dismal state of affairs. The abused party may have low self-esteem, a fluctuating sense of self-worth, primitive defense mechanisms, phobias, mental health problems, a disability, a history of failure, or a tendency to blame herself. Autoplastic defense, to feel inadequate, autoplastic neurosis. This kind of victim may come from an abusive family or environment, which conditioned her to expect abuse as inevitable and normal. In extreme and rare cases, the victim is a masochist, possessed of an urge to seek ill treatment and pain. And gradually the victims convert these unhealthy emotions, this background of mental health dysfunction, and their learned helplessness in the face of persistent gaslighting. They convert all this into psychosomatic symptoms, into anxiety, panic attacks, depression, or in extremis, suicidal ideation and even suicidal gestures. I want to quote from my book, Toxic Relationships, Abuse and Its Aftermath, the November 2005 edition. Therapists, marriage counselors, mediators, court-appointed guardians, police officers, and judges are all human. May come as a shock to you. Some of them are social reactionaries. Others are narcissistic. And a few of these people are themselves spouse abusers. Many things work against the victim facing the justice system and the psychological profession. Let's start with denial. I'm quoting from the book, Toxic Relationships, Abuse and Its Aftermath. Let's start with denial. Abuse is such a horrid phenomenon that society and its delegates often choose to ignore it or to convert it into a more benign manifestation, kind of narrative, typically by pathologizing the situation or the victim rather than the perpetrator. A man's home is still his castle, and the authorities are loath to intrude and intervene. Most abusers are men, most victims are women. Even the most advanced communities in the world are largely still patriarchal and chauvinistic. Misogynistic gender stereotypes, superstitions, biases, prejudices are strong. Therapists are not immune to these ubiquitous and age-old influences and biases. Don't think they have a special lease on objectivity. Therapists are amenable to the considerable charm, persuasiveness, and manipulativeness of the abuser and his impressive thespian acting skills. The abuser offers plausible rendition of the events, interprets the events in his favor. The therapist rarely has a chance to witness, actually witness, an abusive exchange firsthand and at close quarters. In contrast, when the abused victim comes to the therapist, she is often on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She is harassed, unkempt, irritable, impatient, abrasive, and hysterical. Confronted with this contrast between a polished, self-controlled, suave, groomed, charming abuser and his harried casualties, it is easy to reach a conclusion that the real victim is the abuser, or that both parties abuse each other equally. The victim's acts of self-defense, her attempts to be assertive, her insistence on her rights, are interpreted even by therapists as aggression, lability, or a mental health problem. The profession's propensity to pathologize extends to the wrongdoers as well. Alas, few therapists are equipped to do proper clinical work, including diagnosis. Abusers are thought by practitioners of psychology to be emotionally disturbed, the twisted outcomes of a history of familial violence and childhood traumas. They are typically diagnosed as suffering from some kind of personality disorder, an inordinately low self-esteem, or codependence coupled with an all-devouring fear of abandonment. So, example in the case of borderline personality disorder. Consummate abusers use the right vocabulary. They feign the appropriate emotions and affects. They display remorse. They repent. They regret. They're ashamed and guilty ostentatiously. And they sway the therapist and the evaluator's judgment. They're good at manipulating. That's what they do best. But while the victim's pathology works against her, especially in custody battles, the culprit's illness works for him as a mitigating circumstance, especially in criminal proceedings. The system ends up repathologizing and re-traumatizing the victim. Don't forget that. My name is Sam Vaknin, and I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. We know what abuse and torture do to the victim's soul, to her spirit, to her psychology. But what are the effects on the victim's body? There is one place in which one's privacy, intimacy, integrity, and inviolability are guaranteed, and that is one's body. The body is a unique temple. It's a familiar territory of sensor and personal history. The abuser invades, defiles, and desecrates this bodily shrine. He does so, usually, publicly, deliberately, repeatedly, and often sadistically and sexually, with undisguised pleasure. Hence, the all-pervasive, long-lasting, and frequently irreversible effects and outcomes of torture and abuse. In a way, the torture victim's own body is rendered her worst enemy. It is corporeal, bodily agony and pain that compels the sufferer to mutate, her identity to fragment, her ideas and principles to crumble. Very few people can withstand pain. The body becomes the accomplice of the abuser, of the tormentor, an uninterruptible channel of communication of pain, a treasonous, poisoned territory of writhing agony. This fosters a humiliating dependency of the abused on the perpetrator. Bodily needs denied, such as sleep, toilet, food, and water, are wrongly perceived by the victim as the direct causes of her degradation and dehumanization. As the victim sees it, she is rendered bestial not by the sadistic bullies around her, but by her own flesh and blood. Beatrice Patsalidis described this transmogrification in her Ethics of the Unspeakable, Torture Survivors in Psychoanalytic Treatment. She says, as the gap between the I and the me deepens, dissociation and alienation increase. The subject that under torture and abuse was forced into the position of pure object has lost her sense of interiority, intimacy, and privacy. Time is experienced now, in the present only, and perspective, that which allows for a sense of relativity, is foreclosed. Thoughts and dreams attack the mind and invade the body, as if the protective skin that normally contains our thoughts gives us space to breathe in between the thought and the thing being thought about, and separates between inside and outside, past and present, me and you. This skin, as though it were lost. Repeated abuse has long-lasting, pernicious, and traumatic effects, such as panic attacks, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, flashbacks, intrusive memories, and suicidal ideation. Victims and survivors experience psychosomatic or real bodily symptoms, some of them induced by the secretion of stress hormones, such as cortisol. So there is increased blood pressure, racing pulse, headaches, excessive sweating, and myriad self-imputed, or, as I said, real diseases. The victims endure shame, depression, anxiety, embarrassment, guilt, humiliation, abandonment, and an enhanced sense of vulnerability. PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, has been proposed as a new mental health diagnosis by Dr. Judith Herman of Harvard University to account for the impact of extended periods of trauma and abuse. In Stalking, an overview of the problem, authored by Karen Abrams and Gail Ehrlich Robinson in 1998, the authors write, initially, there is often much denial by the victim. Over time, however, the stress begins to erode the victim's life and psychological brutalization results. Sometimes the victim develops an almost fatal resolve that, inevitably, one day she will be murdered. Victims, unable to live a normal life, describe feeling stripped of self-worth and dignity. Personal control and resources, psychosocial development, social support, pre-morbid personality traits, and the severity of the stress may all influence how the victim experiences and responds to it. Victims stalked by ex-lovers may experience additional guilt and lowered self-esteem for perceived poor judgment in their relationship choices. Many victims become isolated and deprived of support when employers or friends withdraw after also being subjected to harassment, or when they are cut off by the victim in order to protect them. Other tangible consequences include financial losses from quitting jobs, moving and buying expensive security equipment in an attempt to regain privacy. Changing homes and jobs results in both material losses and loss of self-respect. Surprisingly, verbal, psychological, and emotional abuse have the same effects as the physical variety. Abuse of all kinds also interferes with the victim's ability to work. Abrams and Robinson wrote in another article titled Occupational Effects of Stalking in 2002. Being stalked by a former partner may affect a victim's ability to work in three ways. First, the stalking behaviors often interfere directly with the ability to get to work. For example, flattening tires or other methods of preventing leaving the home. Second, the workplace may become an unsafe location if the offender decides to appear there. Third, the mental health effects of such trauma may result in forgetfulness, fatigue, lowered concentration, and disorganization. These factors may lead to the loss of employment, with accompanying loss of income, security, and status. Still, it is hard to generalize. Victims are not a uniform lot. In some cultures, abuse is commonplace and accepted as a legitimate mode of communication, a sign of love even, caring, and a boost to the abuser's self-image. In such circumstances, the victim is likely to adopt the norms of society and avoid serious trauma. Deliberate, cold-blooded, and premeditated torture has worse and long-lasting effects than abuse meted out by the abuser in rage and loss of self-control. The existence of a loving and accepting social support network is another mitigating factor. And finally, the ability to express negative emotions safely and to cope with them constructively is crucial to healing. Typically, by the time the abuse reaches critical and all-pervasive proportions, the abuser had already, spider-like, isolated his victim from family, friends, and colleagues. She is catapulted into a netherland, cult-like setting, where reality itself dissolves into a continuing nightmare. When the victim emerges on the other end of this wormhole, the abused woman, or more rarely men, feels helpless, self-doubting, worthless, stupid, and a guilty failure for having botched her relationship and abandoned her family. In an effort to regain perspective and avoid embarrassment, the victim denies the abuse or minimizes it. Small wonder that survivors of abuse tend to be clinically depressed, neglect their health and personal appearance, and succumb to boredom, rage, and impatience. Many end up abusing prescription drugs,
or drinking, or otherwise behaving recklessly. Some victims even develop full-scale post-traumatic stress disorder. Contrary to popular misconceptions, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and acute stress disorder, or acute stress reaction, are not typical responses to prolonged abuse. They are the outcomes of sudden exposure to severe and extreme stressful events. Yet, some victims whose life or body have been directly and unequivocally threatened by an abuser react by developing these symptoms. PTSD is therefore typically associated with the aftermath of physical and sexual abuse in both children and adults. And this is precisely why Dr. Herman suggested the diagnosis of CPTSD, complex PTSD, as we discussed earlier. So, to summarize, victims are affected by abuse in a variety of ways. One's or someone else's looming death, violation, personal injury, or powerful pain are sufficient to provoke the behaviors, cognitions, and emotions that together are known as PTSD. Even learning about such mishaps may be enough to trigger massive anxiety responses. The first phase of PTSD involves incapacitating and overwhelming fear. The victim feels like she has been thrust into a nightmare or a horror movie. We sometimes call it gaslighting. She is rendered helpless by her own terror. She keeps reliving the experience through recurrent and intrusive visual and auditory hallucinations, known as flashbacks, or in sleep, while she sleeps, in dreams. In some flashbacks, the victim completely lapses into a dissociative state and physically reenacts the event while being thoroughly oblivious to her whereabouts and surroundings. In an attempt to suppress this constant playback and the attendant exaggerated startled response, jumpiness, the victim tries to avoid all stimuli associated, however indirectly, with the traumatic event. Many develop full-scale phobias, agoraphobia, claustrophobia, fear of heights, aversion to specific animals, objects, modes of transportation, neighborhoods, buildings, occupations, weather, and even people. Most post-traumatic stress disorder victims are especially vulnerable on the anniversaries of their abuse. They try to avoid thoughts, feelings, conversations, activities, situations, locations, or people who remind them of the traumatic occurrence. These are known as triggers. And it is this constant hypervigilance and arousal, the sleep disorders, mainly insomnia, the irritability, short fuse, and the inability to concentrate and complete even relatively simple tasks, these erode the victim's resilience. Utterly fatigued, exhausted, most patients manifest protracted periods of numbness, automatism, and in radical cases, near catatonic posture. Response times to verbal cues increase dramatically. Awareness of the environment decreases, sometimes dangerously so. The victims are described by their nearest and dearest as zombies, machines, robots, or automata. The victims appear to be sleepwalking, depressed, dysphoric, unhedonic, not interested in anything, or they can find pleasure in nothing. The victims report feeling detached, emotionally absent, estranged, and alienated. Many victims say that their life is over and expect to have no career, family, or otherwise meaningful future. The victim's family and friends complain that she is no longer capable of showing intimacy, tenderness, compassion, empathy, and of having sex due to her post-traumatic frigidity. Many victims become paranoid, impulsive, reckless, self-destructive. Others somatize their mental problems and complain of numerous physical ailments. All of them feel guilty, shameful, humiliated, desperate, hopeless, helpless, and hostile. PTSD need not appear immediately after the harrowing experience. It can, and often does, delay by days or even months. It lasts more than 1 month, usually much longer. Sufferers of PTSD report subjective distress. The manifestations of PTSD are ego-dystonic. They don't like it. Their functioning in various settings, job performance, grades at school, sociability, deteriorate markedly. The DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, criteria for diagnosing PTSD are far too restrictive. PTSD seems to also develop in the wake of verbal and emotional abuse, in the aftermath of drawn-out traumatic situations, such as a nasty divorce. Hopefully, the text will be adopted to reflect this sad and ubiquitous reality.